Neanderthals were not a rough draft of us. They were the other answer to the same question, built from the same raw material. For most of the time, both species shared this planet. Theirs was the one that was working. They lasted somewhere around 350,000 years. Our species, in its current form, has been here for about 300,000. By that measure, the branch of the family everyone calls a failure outlasted us, and we are not finished being tested yet. They are also not entirely gone. If your ancestry traces to anywhere outside of Africa, somewhere between 1 and 2% of your genome was written by Homo neanderthalensis, pronounced neanderthalensis. Not a metaphor, actual code running in your cells right now, authored by a species that has been extinct for 40,000 years. Almost everything about how these people lived, ate, healed, and buried their dead breaks the picture most of us were handed in school. And in a cave in northern Iraq, there is a body that archaeologists have argued over for 50 years, all because of a handful of pollen grains. We'll get to that cave. Start with the mistake that poisoned the story for a century. August of 1856. Quarry workers were clearing a small limestone cave in the Neander Valley, a few miles east of Düsseldorf in Germany. They blasted through the deposits and shoveled out thick, heavy, oddly shaped bones. The foreman figured cave bear and set them aside. A local school teacher named Johann Karl Fuhlrott knew no bear had a skull like that. He brought in Hermann Schaffhausen, an anatomist at Bonn, and in 1857 the two of them announced an ancient form of human being. That was 2 years before Darwin published On the Origin of Species. They were holding the first recognized member of another human species and had no scientific vocabulary to describe it. The response was ridicule. Rudolf Virchow, the most powerful anatomist in Germany, declared the skeleton was a modern man deformed by rickets, repeated blows to the head, and arthritis, a sick peasant. That explanation held for decades because the alternative was unthinkable. Then came the reconstruction that did the real damage. Between 1911 and 1913, the French paleontologist Marcellin Boule published his study of a nearly complete skeleton from La Chapelle-aux-Saints in southern France. He reconstructed the man as stooped and shambling, with bent knees, a forward-thrust head, and a divergent big toe like an ape's. The skeleton he was working from belonged to an individual so crippled by arthritis that he had lost most of his teeth years before he died. Boule was describing the posture of a very sick old man and presenting it as the anatomy of an entire species. That image ran unchallenged into the 1950s. It gave us the cartoon caveman, the club, the grunt, the insult. In 1957, two anatomists named William Strauss and A.J.E. Cave re-examined the same bones and reached the opposite conclusion. Clean him up, give him a shave and a suit, put him on the New York subway, and nobody would look up from their newspaper. So what was actually out there? Look at the body first, because that's where the strangeness begins. A Neanderthal man stood about 5 feet 5 inches and weighed around 170 pounds, sometimes more. Short by our standards, and that is where the resemblance to a small modern man ends. The chest was barrel-shaped and enormous, flaring out toward the bottom to hold larger lungs and a bigger gut. The pelvis was wide. The forearms and shins were short relative to the upper arms and thighs, the same proportions you see in modern populations adapted to serious cold. A compact body holds heat. The bone walls were thick. The muscle attachment sites on the arms and shoulders are enormous. Set a Neanderthal upper arm bone beside a modern one, and the modern one looks like it belongs to a child. If you shook hands with one, your hand would disappear. And then the face, the heavy brow, the forward-projecting midface, and a nasal opening so large it dominates the skull. The long-standing explanation is that the nose warmed and humidified frozen air on the way to the lungs. Newer modeling points instead toward moving huge volumes of air for a body burning fuel at an extraordinary rate. Estimates of daily calorie needs in cold conditions run between about 3,500 and 5,000, roughly double what a person sitting in an office in Ohio needs to get through a day. Their brains were, on average, slightly larger than ours. Hold that loosely because brain size does not map cleanly onto intelligence, and the internal proportions were different. Their eye sockets were bigger and the back of the skull bulged outward. One Oxford team argued that means more of that brain went to vision and body control, and less to the social networking our species runs on. That is a hypothesis, not a conclusion. It matters later. Now put yourself in it. You're standing on a cold floodplain in what is now central Germany, 125,000 years ago. There's a lake in front of you, oak and hazel along the shoreline, and a herd of straight-tusked elephants standing in the shallows. These are not mammoths. Paleoloxodon antiquus, pronounced Paleoloxodon antiquus, stood over 13 feet at the shoulder and weighed up to 13 tons. Twice the mass of a modern African elephant, Neanderthals hunted them, not scavenged, hunted. A 2023 analysis of butchery marks at Neumark-Nord in Germany found the cut patterns of systematic, repeated elephant processing across dozens of animals over centuries. One adult carcass yields something like 2,500 daily portions of food. The group doing the butchering was either far larger than anyone assumed or knew how to preserve meat for months. Their weapon was a wooden spear you had to be close enough to shove. At Lehringen in Germany, archaeologists pulled a ewe-lance more than 7 feet long out of the ribcage of an extinct elephant. The hunter who put it there was standing within arm's reach of an animal the size of a small house. That style of hunting shows up on their skeletons. In 1995, Thomas Berger and Eric Trinkhaus compared Neanderthal injury patterns against modern occupational injury data, and the closest match they found was rodeo riders. Broken ribs, damaged skulls, fractured arms, healed and re-healed. That comparison became famous, and it has since been challenged. A larger 2018 study of skull trauma found injury rates roughly equal between Neanderthals and the early modern humans living alongside them. The violence wasn't a Neanderthal problem, it was a Pleistocene problem, and our own ancestors were bleeding just as much. The most revealing find at Neumark-Nord was not a weapon. In July of 2025, a team from Leiden University and the Leibniz Center published a study of more than 100,000 bone fragments, all of them concentrated in an area smaller than a two-car garage. The bones came from at least 172 large mammals. They had been hauled to that spot, smashed into tens of thousands of pieces and boiled. Boiling crushed bone releases grease, which floats, cools, and can be skimmed off and stored. It's brutal work with no payoff unless you understand what fat does for a body. Lean meat alone will kill you. Eat nothing but protein for a few weeks and your liver can't handle the nitrogen load and you die of something old trappers called rabbit starvation. This was an industrial fat operation that required planning hunts, caching carcasses, and dedicating one site to a single task. Until this find, the earliest evidence of anything like it came from our own species, 100,000 years later. Fire at that scale isn't a campfire skill, it's infrastructure, and they took it places nobody expected. Go into a cave in southwestern France called Bruniquel, pronounced Bruniquel. Walk about 1,100 feet in, past the last reach of daylight, into total dark. On the floor sit 2 rings built from more than 400 pieces of stalagmite, snapped to consistent lengths and arranged deliberately, weighing over 2 tons. There are burn marks on them. Somebody kept fire going down there long enough to work. Uranium series dating puts the construction at about 176,000 years ago. There were no modern humans anywhere in Europe. The only people who could have built it were Neanderthals, working by firelight, a fifth of a mile underground for a reason we cannot name. The list keeps getting longer. At Krapina in Croatia, white-tailed eagle talons with cut marks and polish where they rubbed against something about 130,000 years old, almost certainly worn. At Cueva de los Aviones in southeastern Spain, perforated seashells and containers of mixed mineral pigment. In 3 separate Spanish caves, wall markings that uranium-thorium dating placed at a minimum of 64,000 years, at least 20,000 years before our species reached the region. That dating is contested, and several specialists have published serious objections to the method, so treat it as an open fight. Then there's the glue. They hafted stone points to wooden shafts using birch bark tar, which means heating bark to several hundred degrees Fahrenheit while keeping oxygen away from it. You can't stumble into that. Simpler production methods have since been demonstrated, but every version requires controlling heat and airflow across multiple steps toward a product you can't see until it's finished. Now the cave in Iraq, Shanidar, pronounced Shanidar, sits in the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan. Ralph Solecki excavated it through the 1950s and found the remains of 10 Neanderthals. One of them, catalogued as Shanidar 1 and nicknamed Nandi by the team, changed what people were willing to believe about this species. The man had taken a crushing blow to the left side of his face that probably blinded his left eye. His right arm was withered and ended above the elbow. Bony growths in both ear canals would have left him substantially deaf. His right leg and foot showed old damage that made walking difficult and running impossible. Every one of those injuries had healed. He lived for years, possibly decades after sustaining them. A one-armed, half-blind, mostly deaf man with a ruined leg does not survive an ice age by himself. Somebody fed him, somebody kept him warm. Whatever else Neanderthals were, they did not discard the broken. And then there's Shanidar 4, the reason this cave is famous. In 1968, a paleontologist named Arlette Leroy-Gourhan analyzed the sediment around the body and found dense clumps of pollen from yarrow, cornflower, hollyhock, and grape hyacinth. Solecki concluded the man had been laid to rest on a bed of flowers, and the flower burial entered the public imagination and never left. The evidence hasn't held up. The cave floor contains the burrows of solitary bees, which pack pollen into exactly the tight clumps that were recovered. Rodents move pollen too, and the identified species don't all bloom at the same time of year, so nobody gathered that bouquet in a single afternoon. The team working the site today reads the flower burial as unlikely. The burials themselves are a different matter. Between 2018 and 2022, a Cambridge-led team excavated a new individual a few feet from Solecki's old trench, designated Shanidar Z, roughly 75,000 years old. The upper body was articulated, meaning the bones were still in anatomical position, which does not happen to a corpse left lying on an open cave floor. The body had been placed in a depression with a large stone set behind the head. Something in that cave was putting its dead in the same spot, generation after generation, and marking the location, which makes the other sites harder to hold in your head at the same time. At El Cedron, pronounced El Cedron, in northern Spain, 13 Neanderthals died about 49,000 years ago. Their bones carry cut marks from stone tools, along with fractures made to open the shafts for marrow. Genetic work showed they were a family group, adults, teenagers and children related to each other, butchered with the same technique used on deer. Moulin-Guercy in France shows the same pattern from 100,000 years ago. Bruniquel Cave in Belgium, the same. Starvation, ritual, warfare, or something with no modern equivalent, nobody can say. Both things are true at once. They cared for the crippled for years, and they processed their own dead for marrow. The dental plaque tells a gentler story. Hardened calculus on their teeth trapped microscopic debris from everything that passed through the mouth, and it survives for tens of thousands of years. At El Cedron, one individual with a dental abscess and an intestinal parasite had traces of poplar in his plaque. Poplar bark contains salicylic acid, the active compound in aspirin. The same plaque held penicillium mold. He was taking a painkiller and an antibiotic while he was sick. That could be coincidence. It could also be the oldest evidence of self-medication in the human record. The 2017 team leaned toward the second reading. Others have pushed back, and that's where it sits. Their diet keeps widening as the methods improve. Cooked grass seeds and legumes, pistachios and wild barley at Shanidar. At Figueira Brava in Portugal, around 100,000 years ago, mussels, crabs, sharks, eels, and seals, in quantities that show a group working that coastline for generations. They ate everything, and they cooked it, which leaves the largest question in the field, and the only one that touches you directly. In 2010, a team led by the Swedish geneticist Svante Pääbo, pronounced Svante Pääbo, at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, published the first draft of the Neanderthal genome. They pulled it out of powdered bone against nearly impossible odds of contamination. It won him the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022. The finding nobody was prepared for was that Neanderthal DNA is sitting inside living people. Two independent studies published in late 2024 narrowed the timing. The main pulse of interbreeding began about 50,500 years ago and ran for roughly 7,000 years, centering around 47,000 years ago. Not a rare accident, a sustained overlap between two populations, lasting longer than all of recorded human history. Those inherited stretches are still working. Neanderthal variants influence skin and hair pigmentation, blood clotting, immune response, and pain sensitivity, and one cluster affects whether you naturally wake up early. A segment of chromosome 3 inherited from them carries a substantially higher risk of severe COVID-19, while a different Neanderthal segment on chromosome 12 appears to be protective. 50,000-year-old genetics showing up in intensive care admissions in 2020. There are also holes. Large regions of the modern genome contain almost no Neanderthal sequence at all, particularly on the X chromosome and around genes expressed in the testes. The standard reading is that male hybrids had reduced fertility and those segments got selected out fast. Two species close enough to have children together, far enough apart that the children had problems. It wasn't just them either. In Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a fragment of arm bone from a girl who died around 90,000 years ago was sequenced in 2018. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan, pronounced Denisovan, a separate human population known almost entirely from DNA. She was a first-generation hybrid of two kinds of human, and she turned up on essentially the first try, which suggests this was not remotely unusual. So a species this capable spread from Wales to Siberia, surviving multiple ice ages, disappears around 40,000 years ago. There is no single cause on the table, and the evidence increasingly suggests there never was one. Their numbers were the underlying problem. Genetic diversity across sequenced Neanderthal individuals is strikingly low. That fits small bands scattered thinly across a continent, with an effective breeding population that may never have topped a few thousand. One individual from the Altai had parents who were closely related. Stack the pressures on top of that. The late Pleistocene climate swung violently, with cold snaps arriving in decades rather than millennia. Our species showed up carrying wider social networks, long-distance trade in raw materials, and probably the projectile weapon, which lets you kill from a distance instead of grappling. Every disease each population carried was now shared, and with interbreeding running for 7,000 years, a smaller group being steadily absorbed into a larger one doesn't need to be killed. It just needs to stop being separate. That's likely how it ended. Not a war, a slow demographic squeeze, playing out across hundreds of generations until the last people who were still recognizably separate stopped existing somewhere in Iberia or the Caucasus. Consider what that word still means. We use Neanderthal as an insult, shorthand for stupid, brutish, backward. The whole slur rests on a French anatomist's misreading of one arthritic old man in 1911. The people we named it after buried their dead in the same cave for generations. They kept a one-armed, half-blind man alive for decades. They built something a fifth of a mile inside a pitch-black cave 170,000 years before the first pyramid. They ran a fat rendering site with division of labor. They wore eagle talons. They mixed pigments. They swallowed a plant containing the active ingredient in aspirin while they were sick. They hunted 13-ton elephants at spear range and lived long enough for the breaks to heal. Then they were gone. What's left is a scatter of bones, a handful of stone tools, and a line of code running quietly inside the species that outlived them. The next time you get a cut and the blood clots, or you wake up before your alarm without knowing why, consider the odds. You may be running an instruction written by somebody who died in a cold European cave 40,000 years ago. They lost, and they're still here, in as much as 1 out of every 50 letters of the book that builds you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.